Hello, good evening, noswaith dda, croeso. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Welsh tradition of a Mari Lwyd. Some of you may be familiar with what the Mari Lwyd is, but for those of you who aren't, it was a kind of a performance. The main character in this performance in Wales was the Mari Lwyd herself. So there you can see a party of men, and that strange looking figure in the middle there, it's a man with a sheet covering his body and what's essentially a horse's skull decorated with ribbons and stars and different types of decoration. And what these parties of men would do at the winter time is that they would go knocking on doors throughout the parish, and they'd sing a specific song. They would go through a specific sequence of verses to begin with, essentially presenting themselves to the people inside the house, and the people on the inside would lock the door, they'd lock the windows, they'd lock the back door, just to make sure that no one could get in or out, and they'd try and deny entry to the Mari Lwyd and the party of singers. And the party of singers would essentially challenge the people on the inside of the house to sing a verse for every verse that they would sing. And this would go on for hours and hours on end, until in the end the Mari Lwyd party, this party of men, would win the singing contest and gain entry to the house. When they were inside, the Mari Lwyd would start chasing the children and the women around the house. It had a clacking jaw. They'd cause havoc and essentially perform this strange, crazy, chaotic dance around the house. And then the Mari Lwyd and the party of singers, they'd be given beer and food and sent on their way. They would almost certainly get drunk and they'd end up at some point probably falling in a ditch or even having a fight with another bunch of Mari Lwyd performers. It was kind of a very wild, raucous, drunken celebration in the middle of winter. Now, just to be a little bit more specific about what was actually happening during these celebrations, there was, for example, the Mari Lwyd herself, who was essentially a horse skull decorated with ribbons and the white sheet. Sometimes the ribbons decorating the horse's skull would be given by the women of the parish, sometimes by the lovers and wives of the men carrying the Mari Lwyd around the parish. Sometimes it wasn't even a white sheet, sometimes it was a woman's shawl that was given to make the Mari Lwyd's body. And there's obviously a close association between the Mari Lwyd and women. Not just the fact that women would sometimes give their ribbons and their shawls to dress the Mari Lwyd. The Mari Lwyd had an interest in the women on the inside of the house, and this might have been some kind of fertility ritual to ensure bad spirits would be cast out of the house. Now, that's a theory that more recent scholars don't necessarily agree with, but there has been a general trend over the last 150 years of talking about the Mari Lwyd that this is actually the case. And there are good reasons for this interpretation, which I'll go into later on. Now, there were other characters accompanying the Mari Lwyd. I'll just show you another photo where it's a little bit clearer. So there's a recent Mari Lwyd celebration going on in the Brigans Inn in Dinas Mawddwy. And there you can see there's the Mari Lwyd, the horse's skull with the ribbons and the sheet. And the Mari Lwyd is led by a well-dressed man. Traditionally this was the ostler smart, like a smart, well-dressed gentleman leading the Mari Lwyd through the parish. And the ostler smart and the Mari Lwyd were also accompanied by a Punch and Judy figure. And they're actually called Punch and Judy in the Welsh tradition, obviously a borrowing from the English folk tradition. And the Punch and Judy figures in the Welsh Mari Lwyd are very interesting. They essentially create more havoc in the house, to be even more raucous, to do crazy spinning dancing where the Punch and the Judy would spin each other round and round and round until they both got dizzy. They'd obviously be drinking loads as well, but they also did a few other very interesting things. So, for example, the Judy character would often carry a broom. In the image that you're looking at there, the Judy character is in a blue dress and she's carrying a rolling pin, which is funny. But traditionally the Judy character would have a broom and would go into the house and would first of all put out the fire and would sweep up the kitchen, in a sense to drive out the bad spirits from the household. It's interesting that the Judy character, the woman character, is doing this because, again, it gives this focus on the women in the Mari Lwyd tradition. We don't know how old the Mari Lwyd tradition is. It's impossible to say. The earliest reference to Mari Lwyd performance in Wales is from the turn of the 1800s, from a book that was written in 1798. And then there are various other accounts that develop through the 1800s and the 1900s and into the early 20th century. But it's quite likely that the Mari Lwyd tradition had actually died out in most parts in Wales by the middle of the 20th century, and it's only been revived in the last sort of 20, 30 years. There have been some quite large Mari Lwyd celebrations. For example, there was an enormous Mari Lwyd at the millennial celebrations in Aberystwyth in the year 2000. And the picture that you're looking at there from the Brigand's Inn, that's a celebration that continues to this day. I was at the Mari Lwyd celebration just a few weeks back, and I'll show you some video footage of that in a little bit. So even though it appears to be a folk tradition that has clear non-Christian pagan connotations, it's not clear how old it is or how far back it goes. We know that it was always enacted during the winter time, either 2 or 3 weeks before Christmas, through the Christmas period, through the New Year period, all the way into the middle of January. So there's a good 6-7 week period in the winter time. It's mainly a South Walian tradition. As you can see in this map here, you can see most of the dots are down in Morgannwg, down in the very south of Wales, and only a few dots to the east in Monmouthshire, a few dots to the west in Carmarthenshire, and very, very sparse after that further to the north. So it's obviously something that's special to Morgannwg. It's not clear if it was once widespread all over Wales and if it just survived in Morgannwg and died out everywhere else, or if it arrived with people coming to work in Morgannwg. The places where the Mari Lwyd was active does map rather neatly onto the coal mining communities of South Wales and the other mineral rich areas in the region. So it might have been a tradition that was brought to Wales by English miners coming to work in the Welsh pits. That could be one reason, but there are certain hints and clues that lead me, and not everybody, but a few other researchers, to assume that it could also have Welsh roots, very distinct Welsh roots, just that it's got mixed up with broader, more common traditions of Britain. Now, when we talk of the origins of the Mari Lwyd and how far back it could go, we need to bear in mind that these folk traditions aren't pure in the sense that there is just one version of them. There are many, many, many different versions of the Mari Lwyd tradition. Each parish would have done it slightly differently, would have performed it at different times of that winter period. Some parishes only performed it for one night, other parishes made a whole week's festivities of the Mari Lwyd. What's clear is that there was always a singing component, and the singing component is very interesting because it's in the words of the song that the Mari Lwyd party sings that we get the clearest suggestions of what the Mari Lwyd meant for local people. I'm just going to play for you one video that shows a small Mari Lwyd party visiting a house. Now, this isn't exactly how a Mari Lwyd celebration would have looked like. This is obviously staged. The performers are a little bit stiff. They're probably not that familiar with being on a camera. They've probably never seen a camera before, to be honest with you, this being back in the 50s. But you can see the type of performance that it would be in front of a house, and more importantly you can hear the song that was sung introducing the Mari Lwyd to the household.
Wel dyma ni'n dywed gobeithio'n di niwed I ofyn am gynad, I ofyn am gynad, I ofyn am gynad I ganu. Os na chawn I gynad rwch glywed goniad, pa fodd mae'r madawiad, pa fodd mae'r madawiad, pa fodd mae'r madawiad nos enw. Mae'r Mari Lwyd yma llawn sir ar y gona, mae'n werthu roi gola, mae'n werthu roi gola, mae'n werthu roi gola I wyled. Os does yma ddynion a llunio yn glynion yn rhwyddrewch atebion, yn rhwyddrewch atebion, yn rhwyddrewch atebion i'r bechgyn. Rwy wedi rafeddu bod dyffryn ac unwy yn ffeili cynhyrchu, gwella eisiau I ganu, gwella eisiau I ganu'r noes enw.
So there you heard a man indoors answering the party outside, and that exchange could go on for hours and hours and hours until the Mari Lwyd and the party was finally let in. Now, of course, that was staged, it was a bit stiff. In reality, it would have been middle of the night, there would have been lanterns and candles, so all in firelight, and crazy drunken men outside singing raucously to try and gain entry to the house. Now, if we look at the words of the song of the Mari Lwyd tradition, we do find some interesting things. There are many versions of this song, the singing that took place, but they all follow a very similar pattern. It would almost always begin with the women of the household hearing the Mari Lwyd party arriving in the area with bells and jangles and staff beats and whooping and laughter, and they would close the doors, they'd close all the windows, they'd lock the place up, and they'd sing this song. Gloesoch I drysa ma boes y cwrseila, yn siŵr oedd o dyma, yn siŵr oedd o dyma, yn siŵr oedd o dyma I ganu, which means, did you lock the doors? The wassail boys are sure to come here to sing. And then the wassail party, the Mari Lwyd party, would arrive at the door and they'd sing this song. Well, here we come, innocent friends, to ask for permission to sing. So it takes on this very formal sort of ritual pattern that was followed every year, more or less the same pattern in every area. Now, often it would be the older people in the house who would be able to sing an answer for every verse sung by the Mari Lwyd party. Remember, the Mari Lwyd party sings one verse, and then it's up to the people inside to answer with another verse, and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. So you had to know lots of verses if you were going to sort of try and win this contest with the Mari Lwyd. Of course, many of these verses would have been made up on the spot, and also many of them would have been memorised. So it was usually the older folk that could do this. And in the verses that I've got for you here, it's a man on the inside, so the man of the household responding to the Mari Lwyd. And this is the kind of thing that the man would say. The cats and the dogs are running for the holes from listening to such voices this night. So essentially, they would start slagging each other off. They'd start making fun of each other. And to this verse, the Mari Lwyd party respond, "Now listen, funny man, your breath stinks through 2 yards of oak," that is the door that's between them, "tonight, this evening." And then the singer on the inside would respond again, "Well, you'll stand outside for a week, and part of a fortnight and a month, if there be cause this night, if you're not good enough to sing enough verses to get in." And then, of course, the party outside, the raucous men, they'd expect to have drink and food when they come in, and they're sort of asking the people on the inside to break open the barrels for them. Oh, tap the barrel, let it flow freely. Do not be miserly to singers. Please give us some booze and some food so that we can have enough energy to carry on with the Mari Lwyd celebration. And then after this kind of call and response, it would go on for a while, of course. It would usually end with some kind of threat. Here, the singer on the inside is threatening that the priest, Jenkins the priest, is coming, I swear, and he'll make you leave my dwelling. Which is interesting in many ways, because we know that many of the Christian leaders of the time were very uncomfortable with the Mari Lwyd tradition. They didn't really want their parishioners to be acting in such pagan and raucous ways. Once the party had been given entry to the house and given beer and food, and they'd chased the folk around and caused a big stir, and the Judy of the Punch and Judy pair had put the fire out and swept the floor and essentially blessed the place in many ways, you would then have a last song by the party before they left, and it would be sung in a different meter, in a different kind of verse. And it would go like this, singing about the Mari Lwyd now. She's a lovely, lively mare. Thousands praise her. Her head is famous and knotty. She's full of unsurpassed medicines. So this idea that the Mari Lwyd is bringing some good wishes and goodwill, good energy into the abode, that this is a good thing, that the Mari is famous for doing this, yeah? And it's something that we'll talk a little bit more about later on. But it's important to point out that the Mari Lwyd was a positive figure, even though she was actually quite scary. Little kids were probably terrified of the Mari Lwyd, this horse's skull covered in ribbons and bells and stars and a big sheet and a clacking mouth that would chase them around the house. Yeah, obviously quite a scary thing, meant to inspire and evoke fear. But just to finish on these verses in the departing song now, the pretty mare is starving and the little ass about to collapse. We're not sure who the little ass is, perhaps referring to one of the characters accompanying the Mari Lwyd, from wanting some succour to keep them alive. Sorry, I've missed out the M there. Give them something to comfort them. Essentially asking the inhabitants of the house to feed the Mari Lwyd and the party accompanying her. That feeding the Mari Lwyd is an important part of the ritual, an important part of the custom. Just to outline what's going on here, there's a party of men, they're all men, visiting a house. The women inside the house are who the Mari Lwyd and the party are interested in. The Mari Lwyd is a horse's skull, obviously evoking death and fear and monstrous things, and the Mari Lwyd wants to chase the women and the little children of the house. There's a competition between the inhabitants and the Mari Lwyd party. The Mari Lwyd party gain entry, and then the Judy sweeps the hearth and puts the fire out and blesses the dwelling, and then the party accompanying the Mari Lwyd ask the household to feed the Mari Lwyd, to give her food, to give her nourishment, and to feed the accompanying singers as well. So this is obviously a symbolic custom, yeah? There's obviously some meaning to it. Now, I'm not saying that today I'm going to interpret exactly what that meaning was, but I think we can make some very general interpretations about what the custom means. Obviously, each age or each generation that inherited the Mari Lwyd custom would have made slightly different uses of her, and probably had slightly different meanings for the custom as it evolved. But that's not to say that there aren't these general tendencies that we can spot in the tradition. There's obviously this combination of fertility and death. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's quite likely that the Mari Lwyd in many ways stems from a fertility ritual, evoking the fertility of animals and land and farmed land in particular in the middle of winter to try and ensure its return perhaps. But it's interesting that that evocation is focused on the women of the household. It's as if their fertility in particular is of interest to the Mari Lwyd, especially when we consider that the Mari Lwyd in some parishes was dressed in the ribbons and the shawl of the lovers and wives of the men carrying the Mari Lwyd, that their relationship had something to do with it. Now, horses, of course, have a special relationship with fertility and the abundance of the land in Wales, as they do in other parts of the world, and especially in other Celtic traditions. But in Welsh folk tradition, in later Welsh folk tradition, we also find horses playing a central part in the fertility of married couples. There's one tradition that Marie Trevelyan mentions in her collection of Welsh folklore, where after a marriage ceremony, the bride and groom would get on the back of a horse and ride home. But if the bridegroom touched the reins or tried to steer the horse in any way, then that would be bad luck for the marriage, and they would be childless. So it was important that the bridegroom gave the horse its head, allowed the horse to follow its own way home, suggesting that the bride and the bridegroom trust the horse to find its way home, that the freedom of the horse, the wildness, if you like, the innate nature of the horse, had something to do with the abundance and fruitfulness of this new marriage. We also find in North Wales traditions of horse skulls being placed outside the houses of women who'd been having an affair, women who had been caught with another lover and were being shamed by the local community by putting this horse head either outside the door or up above the door. So we know that the horse skull, is already associated in other traditions with fertility or lack of fertility, and that the horse was obviously an animal that symbolised abundance in a more general sense. And we see this going all the way back to the Iron Age period, with coins, many Celtic coins stamped with the image of horses. Clearly the horse being a symbol of abundance and wealth. So in the Mari Lwyd tradition, it's quite likely that it's not absolutely clear, but it's quite likely that the Mari Lwyd is interested in the women of the household, and the Judy character in particular supports that role in sweeping out the kitchen, putting out the fire, and making sure that the place is clean and new, so that the fire can be relit for a new year, a new spring, a new summer, a new term of fruitfulness and abundance, and perhaps a new term of fruitfulness for the women of the household. So that's one way of looking at the tradition. Not every scholar or researcher, particularly in the last few decades, is necessarily going to agree with that, but I think it's definitely one way we can at least interpret the activities of the Mari Lwyd. Now, there's another very interesting aspect to the Mari Lwyd and the whole idea of a symbolic horse in the Welsh tradition. Many people try and see the Mari Lwyd in particular as a much later version of an Iron Age horse goddess, perhaps mediated through the medieval figure of Rhiannon. Now, Rhiannon, of course, is one of the more important characters from the first branch of the Mabinogi, also appears in the third branch. In the first branch of the Mabinogi, she appears on a magical horse, and even though she rides the horse very slowly across the plain, no one can catch her. So definitely a magical figure, mythological figure. And of course, in the first branch, she marries Pwyll. They have a child. But of course, immediately after Pwyll and Rhiannon's child is born, it disappears. And the midwives looking after Rhiannon, worried that they're going to get blamed for the disappearance of this infant, and therefore they kill some puppies, they smear Rhiannon with blood and scatter the bones of the puppies across her and tell everybody, well, we don't know what happened to the baby, but perhaps Rhiannon ate her own child. In that particular scene, we also have this association of death and fertility. We have a mother who's just given birth being accused of killing her own child. Yeah. There's also the association with horses. Rhiannon, as punishment for this crime that she didn't actually commit, her punishment is to behave like a horse. She appears on a horse. There are other horse associations throughout the first branch. So we have a horse figure who is associated with death and fertility in the first branch. And we also have the Mari Lwyd tradition, essentially 700, 800 years after the writing of the first branch of the Mabinogi, which also has this horse figure associated with death and fertility. Now, to be clear, I am not saying that these are necessarily directly connected events. I'm not saying that they're part of the same unique tradition. What I am suggesting is that there could be a connection between the two, in that they are both expressions of a general cultural tendency, a very similar cultural tendency that associates the symbolic horse with death and fertility. Now, this is interesting for several reasons, not only because it at least suggests the survival of a general mythology surrounding horses, but it also suggests that this mythology goes back further in time than the Mari Lwyd tradition. How far back? It's impossible to say. But it could go back all the way to the Iron Age, if not further. We know that the Welsh, the British of early Britain, say around the period after the Romans have left, between the 400s and the 700s, if not later, were really fond of dressing up as animals, particularly during the winter season. For example, we have a record of an archbishop, the Archbishop of Theodore, complaining about this practice. He writes in the 7th century, "If anyone at the calends of January goes about as a stag or a bull, that is, making himself into a wild animal and dressing in the skin of the herd animal and putting on the heads of beasts," perhaps also dressing up as a horse, for example, "those who are in such wise transform themselves into the appearance of a wild animal, penance for 3 years, because this is devilish." So obviously the church were not fond of people dressing up, particularly if they had horns on their heads. You can imagine why. And this, of course, continues well into the modern period with the Methodists and different church officials complaining about the Mari Lwyd tradition. But it's quite likely that this was an ancient practice even all the way back then in the time of Archbishop Theodore. I think St. Augustine complains about it as well in the 4th century. We obviously have figures such as the cross-legged Cernunnos figure on the Gunderstrup cauldron, which could have been created back in the 1st century BC, if not older, so 2,100 years ago at least, the figure with the stag horns. Yeah? So there is a general trend in Celtic cultures and other cultures across the world. It's not unique to the Celtic cultures by any stretch of the imagination, but specifically within the Celtic cultures, there is this trend of humans symbolically transforming into animals. People dressing up as stags, people dressing up as bulls, perhaps dressing up as horses. It's interesting that on many Celtic coins, on one side of the coin we have the horse running in one direction, and then if you turn the coin over you have a human face, and it's as if the human face and the horse are facing each other on opposite sides of the coins, again suggesting a relationship between the human and the animal. So I would say that there are some strong hints that the Mari Lwyd tradition is indeed very ancient. If only we're talking about this concept of human beings transforming themselves into animals, which is essentially what the Mari Lwyd singer is doing. And it's interesting that at least in this later period of the Welsh folk tradition of the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, that common folk still found great joy and celebration to be had in evoking this strange, monstrous figure as a blessing spirit, as a spirit that could ensure the fertility of the women of the household. We could go on now to a further conversation about how the Mari Lwyd is in fact not just a uniquely Welsh phenomena, but actually relates to many of the other covered animal traditions throughout Britain. We've got the obios, the hobby horses in southern England, the vast array of English traditions that include some kind of animal, very often a horse, sometimes even a horse's skull even painted and covered in a sheet. I'll just show you how the tradition has evolved now, what it looks like today. This is a film that I took a couple of weeks back, just down the road here in Dinas Mawddwy. There you could see there was the party of men with the Mari Lwyd, there was the Judy figure, there was also a punch figure also with a big club, the kids of course having a whale of a time, and then the women in the back room of the pub singing there as well. And it's still seen as a tradition that somehow sets the men against the women. In that verse there, for those of you who understand Welsh, you could hear that the women were singing, the men of Dinas Mawddwy are stinky and dirty after they've been playing rugby, and the men then responding saying, well, we drink loads of cider and we love it. So it's quite a laugh, to be honest with you. But there you see the tradition sort of reinvented for the modern era. Now, just to prove the point that these traditions do evolve, I wouldn't necessarily say that all of the people there are evoking the spirit of the Mari Lwyd as a spirit to ensure fertility amongst the women. I would say that the tradition today is used to acknowledge and define a modern Welsh identity. It's often used to bolster local Welsh folks who feel the pressure of English culture, Anglo-American culture in particular, and who want to reaffirm their national identity by doing something that connects them with their ancestors in the past. As part of the modern celebrations, we often find people turning up dressed up in old-fashioned clothing. I remember in school, for St. David's Day, for example, the adults would often dress the kids up in old-fashioned clothing, so the boys in like flat caps and waistcoats and cheesecloth shirts, and the girls in their red frocks and their petticoats and the red shawl and the big black hats, yeah, traditional Welsh dress. And this is interesting because it's almost like an unconscious ancestor worship in many ways. That's not what they're intending to do, but it's interesting that in modern Wales we find it necessary to evoke the whole notion of our ancestors as we're trying to affirm our national identities. So just to show that the traditions do evolve, they do change, and they mean different things to each successive generation. I did promise that I would respond to some questions. So Chris Hughes wants a citation for the Judy putting the fire out. That's something that's in this book here, which is the source I use on the Mari Lwyd tradition. This is by the very talented scholar Rhiannon Ifans. It's called Seirs a Rhabana, Stars and Ribbons, which is one of the lyrics from the Mari Lwyd song. Unfortunately, it's written in Welsh, so I can give you the page reference if you want, but you're going to have to learn Welsh to be able to read it. I'm not sure if there are English sources that mention that. I'd imagine that there are. There have been various English researchers that have written about the Mari Lwyd. I'm afraid I haven't read any of the English research. I've only read the Welsh research, I'm afraid. Rhiannon Evans and various other folks. But I think Ronald Hutton has written about the Mari Lwyd, a modern scholar researcher now. Wondering about the way that the Mari is quickly being adopted by people who don't really even identify with Welsh culture. They just think it's cool. Thought? Well, we're on to quite an intense topic there. I have spoken about cultural appropriation in an earlier post. It depends how they're doing it and what they're doing. If they are presenting themselves in a way that's respectful to the tradition, if you like. For example, if it's a bunch of Americans over in the States doing it, I'd be like, yeah, brilliant. If it's a bunch of Japanese people over in Japan doing it, I'd be like, yeah, brilliant. It only gets tricky if you've got English incomers coming into an area in Wales and putting it on in a Welsh area where there are Welsh folk who also are associated with the Mari Lwyd tradition, because they would probably think, well, why didn't you just join in with us? For example, the Mari Lwyd celebrations in the Brigand's Inn, the film footage that you've just seen, lots of people turn up. Whoever's living in the area, Welsh or English or wherever you're from, everybody's welcome to turn up. And a big effort is made to welcome incomers, particularly in translating for them the different events, different parts of the activity, perhaps what some of the lyrics mean. There is an attempt to welcome Welsh learners in particularly. If they're making an effort to learn the language, they're definitely welcomed in and encouraged to take part. So in that sense, in the modern setting, I would say that it's really seen as an event whereby we can bring different aspects, different subcultures within the community together and try and build some bridges between the different linguistic cultures. So in that sense, it's a very positive thing. I would just say that if there are English folk in Wales who want to put on the Mari Lwyd celebration, and there aren't any Welsh folk interested in doing it, well, just do it anyway, because it's fun, isn't it? But I would certainly see it as an opportunity to build bridges between the communities. So if you can see it in that light and use it in that way, I think that's a far more positive use of the tradition than simply going off and doing it on your own. Although it's a free country, I don't think we should legislate against people doing the Mari Lwyd if they're not Welsh. I'm by no means interested in that whatsoever. I think it's also okay to have strong opinions about it. Freedom of speech and all that. Is there any known specific way that the horse skull is gotten? Are they family heirlooms themselves or just how they're dressed? Well, very interestingly, in many parishes it was one family that looked after the skull, and every year it was stripped of its decorations and it was buried in the ground, sometimes buried in lime, sometimes just buried in the soil. Now, Rhiannon Evans mentions that this is just to ensure that the bone doesn't yellow with age and that it maintains its whiteness. But, it's interesting that the horse's skull is kept in the earth and brought out of the earth every year, as if it's revived in some way, as if it's brought back to life, as if it's been dead and buried and it's dug up and brought to life and put to good use, almost like an embodiment of this very powerful complex of death and fertility, this very powerful symbolic combination. It's dead, but it lives again. We see it in many, many different folk traditions. The whole English tradition of John Barleycorn, for example, the living and the dying embodiment of the harvest. Sometimes the Mari Lwyd skull was kept in the local pub, because often it was the young farm hands that would be responsible for putting on the Mari Lwyd celebration. It was very rarely kept at the farms that it would visit. So it was obviously something that was associated with boozing and having fun and being wild and crazy and having a good time. But also it's interesting that it was the hot-blooded young guys who would often be chasing the young ladies, and perhaps even the other young guys of the area, who were responsible for the Mari Lwyd, that it was their energy that carried the Mari Lwyd out into the parish. I think that's interesting in itself as well. I'm interested in understanding how long the pagan culture held on in Wales. It seems like at least through the 1100s. This idea that there are non-Christian elements, and I say non-Christian because at the time they wouldn't necessarily have thought of themselves as pagans. Of course, in modern pagan culture, pagan is a self-referential term. But in the past, it's not that clear that they would even considered what they were doing to be even non-Christian. It was simply part of their culture. Of course, when church leaders and chapel leaders would complain about these non-Christian elements of Welsh folk culture, they would probably get the idea, well, maybe this is pagan. But I think in essence, I don't really think it was framed in that way in Welsh folk culture. Especially at times when these folk traditions would happen far away from the urban centres. So, for example, when a bunch of lads decide to go to the local pub and get drunk, and they know it's winter time, and they're going to get the horse's skull out, and they're going to go and scare some children and some women, and they're going to have a good time, and there might be this thing where they're evoking the spirit of fertility, but they're not necessarily thinking about it in pagan non-Christian terms, if you see what I mean. It's just something that they do. This framing of Christian and non-Christian, I would say, is something that we back project onto history very often. That's not to say that the Christian church didn't comment on many of these practices, but how much of that commentary penetrated into actual folk culture, I think is very difficult to say. I would say that because these practices lasted for so long, most of the people enacting these folk traditions weren't really that bothered what the church elders or chapel elders thought of them, and they probably didn't frame it in these terms of pagan and non-pagan. So that's the first important thing to mention. But if from the perspective of the present moment we are talking in terms of the history of paganism in Wales as we understand it from a modern perspective, I would say that paganism or aspects of pagan culture have lasted up until this day. I would say that there are elements of Welsh folk culture that still have a non-Christian root, a non-Christian source. It's just that in the modern period they've been conflated with Christianity. Christianity and paganism aren't necessarily mutually opposing cultural forces. Of course, the different authorities in those communities will have it that these are opposing cultures and they're nothing to do with each other. But in actual practice, in actual daily life, in the actual folk culture of our history, people wouldn't have necessarily differentiated between a Christian influence and a pagan influence. They just simply would have brought them together. So, for example, in the Mari Lwyd custom, this is obviously pagan, non-Christian, but they often evoke God in the verses. They swear by God, they swear by their Christian souls. They sometimes talk about Mary, as in Mother Mary. Mary may be evoked in the very name of the Mari Lwyd. Some folklorists believe that the Mari in Mari Lwyd is actually a borrowing from the earlier Catholic traditions of Mary, and Mary being portrayed in an effigy and carried around the parishes. I wouldn't say that's exactly what's going on with the Mari Lwyd, but it could easily be an influence. And there are many, many of these influences that are conflated in these traditions. So The whole notion of a pure pagan culture or a pure Christian culture doesn't really make sense when you look at how cultures actually evolve and change and give out and receive influences. Of course, from the position of pure Christian practitioners or pure pagan practitioners, they will choose specific aspects of a tradition to exaggerate so as to justify their own relationship to the tradition, of course, be they Christians or pagans or Muslims or Buddhists or Taoists or whatever. Yeah, people with a personal relationship to a personal belief system will obviously find pure histories for themselves, and there's nothing wrong with that. But looking at it with more of an overview, if you like, you can see that in essence that's not how many of these folk cultures came about or how they survived or persisted from one generation to the next.